Thank you all for joining us. So today in our expert-led technology session, it's going to focus on the TAPPI programme, which stands for Technology for Our Ageing Population Panel for Innovation. And it's a programme funded by the Dunhill Medical Trust, and it includes 6 test beds across the UK, working with Technology Enabled Care Services Association and Housing LIN, with the kind of underlying principles of co-production, interoperability and person-centred care. And each of the test beds, organisations are working with tenants, residents and staff to sort of think about technology-enabled care in these contexts. So today, we've got Nathan from the TSA, who is part of the TAPPI programme, and Vikki Hiscocks, who is part of Pobl, which is one of the testbed sites. And just to give you a bit more background into both of them, Vikki is the head of research and development within the Pobl Group, which is a really big housing care and support provider based in South Wales. As I said, Pobl is part of one of those TAPPI test beds, and has been working with also policymakers such as the Older People's Commissioner for Wales. And I think I'll leave it to Vikki to sort of talk a bit more about Pobl and what they're doing with the test bed. And Nathan is part of the TSA and works with stakeholders from across the sector to think about moving from analog to digital, but also innovation and thinking about implementing technology-enabled care to enhance people's well-being and independence. So without further ado, I'll hand over to our speakers to take us through what they've been doing with the TAPPI programme.
Thank you very much. Hopefully I'll get a nod that everyone can hear me okay. Oh, there we go. Good. Always good start. So yes, thank you very much for having me along. So my name is Nathan Downing from the TSA. So I'm going to say a few words about the world of TAPPI and everything that's been going on for the past 18 months, and then hopefully I can then hand over to Vikki, who can give you the real stuff in terms of what it really feels like on the ground to be thinking differently around housing with care and what role technology plays and all the other stuff that comes with it. And then it'd be great after that, obviously, to have all of your questions, but also your comments, your thoughts, and a discussion around what you've been learning, anything you might want to ask us about. And please don't be shy, ask anything. Hopefully we'll have some of the, certainly the practical answers. I'm not sure if you ask us to anything too grand, whether we can, don't ask us for government policy. We can have a view, but I don't think we can change the way things are doing at the moment. But I'm just going to use a few slides if I can remember how to. So yes, a little bit about TSA whilst we do that. So I head up membership and consultancy in TSA. We're a not-for-profit membership body, all things advising around not just in the technology, but frankly, how do we better support people to achieve their own outcomes, whether that's across a health system, whether it's in social care, whether it's in housing, and what's the role for technology to play in supporting services to be delivered differently. So we don't make any widgets. We do have lots of members that provide different types of technology, different types of data sources. We have those from a housing background, care provision. We have those from commissioners in local government and the NHS, as well as service provision. But ultimately, it's how do we connect people together to think about what's the better support we can offer to people and what is the role for technology to play. This isn't about everything being technology-led, which I'll kind of come on to in the whole learning from TAPPI, but it's very much around people enriching people's everyday lives. So now I can. So this is phase 2. So TAPPI has been something that's been around actually for about 3 years. So obviously you'll learn obviously what TAPPI means. You can say panel for innovation, or you could say from policy to implementation, or practice. So everyone's got it. But yeah, panel for innovation was what it was originally. Set up on the background of things like, if you're familiar with HAPPI, I'm sure a lot of you will be. So the HAPPI principles years ago, and it was actually what can we look at in an initial inquiry in the end of October 21 about the opportunities and the issues around supporting people within housing. Generally, I think a lot of this is about when it says the ageing population. This isn't just about what we might class as older people, I think, and frankly, what does older people really mean these days? It is about people that are wanting to live their lives in some form of group living setting in particular in this position, but it isn't necessarily about older people. It's about people moving away from home the first time with learning disabilities, for example, that wanting to obviously aging well in that situation. So whilst a lot of the talk does focus on older people in general, you'll find, and obviously I think Vikki will back this up in terms of how Pobl support people and who they support, it is a lot more an all-age approach. So the original panel had lots of different players and policymakers in there, linked to other reports and commissions like the ADAS white paper that TSA worked on, Future of Housing Care from Sky, the all-party parliamentary group on AT, and came up with understanding, well, I don't think too many of these are things you wouldn't expect. You know, people must be at the heart of care technology, almost saying that like it must be a given, but I think we'd all probably think, yes, but actually at the moment, is it actually in practice what it might be saying in theory? There's lots of siloed things that are going on. I think that probably continues, and we'll cover that. And they came up with a set of 10 principles, which you'll all be, by the end of this, and no doubt you'll be having T-shirts with this on eventually. These are the 10 principles that originally were produced from TAPPI 1. And the challenge in TAPPI 2 is to test those in a set of test beds to understand to what extent, as you engage with your workforce, with those that you support, to what extent do these guiding principles support you in your thinking? So every time you're thinking about a new service or a new build or retrofitting where people currently live, how do you make sure that these principles are the heart of your thinking and then your delivery? And frankly, are these the right 10 principles? One of the questions. 10's quite a lot. So we'll start to come on to what we're getting to. But ultimately, does this weave into the conversations you're having with all of the partners you're working with? Can we show what's needed and what's possible? What works, what doesn't work? How do we break down some of what seems to be impossible? And can we actually, originally we talked about co-producing a TAPPI framework for action. Realistically, a framework in this case is a set of simple tools that people can use if they wanted to do this themselves. What we found is that actually there's no point writing a 50-page policy document that will sit and gather dust on the shelf. What are the simple things, and frankly, what are the stories that people can tell from the experience of TAPPI that will help others who might be planning or starting a movement, as it says at the bottom there? So therefore, we're very grateful to have partners. Obviously, we're extremely grateful for Dunhill Medical Trust for funding both TAPPI 1 and TAPPI 2. As Kate said, TSA working in partnership with Housing LIN to hold the programme together. But really the stars of everything TAPPI related are those 2 engagement partners. So Co-Production Works, working with those in the 6 test beds and their tenant champions and staff champions, and then Cambridge Centre for Housing Planning Research, looking at how you can go about evaluating. Probably more around at this stage, they've been looking at what do people think about the principles, what are the key challenges, etc. But part of it was actually how do we support people? So if you want to evaluate something, where do you start? You know, what do you measure? How do you engage people, etc. And then the most important people on this are the 6 test beds that were selected from about 33, I think, that applied through a process. So we have obviously Vikki can talk far better about Pobl than I can. So Pobl in Wales, Build in Scotland, and then the other 4 organisations within England. So Wiltshire Council, who commissions services and housing, Platform Housing Group, obviously speaks for itself, Haringey in London, and they were looking at a range of different housing solutions, whether that be bespoke housing for people with complex needs, sheltered, extra care in people's own homes, and then Southend Care, who are a care provider predominantly in the area of learning disabilities, and part of Southend Council. And I'll just check that I'm not going to ramble too much, I'll be quicker. And really, what we realised is it's far more about hands-on support. So each of the test beds will have their own starting point. Some were very more familiar with technology than others. Build, for example, in Scotland, supports several thousand people with a technology-enabled care service they deliver. So they deliver the 24/7 monitoring of alerting technologies, etc. They have 4,500 tenants across lots of schemes, and they're engaged with lots of the 21 of the 32 health and social care partnerships in Scotland. So very much more at the mature end of how to engage with technology. Others were starting their journey, and again, I'd hope Vikki would probably talk a bit more of that from their perspective. But really, how do you, when we say co-production, I think everyone talks about co-production. What's that? Everyone has a different starting point, was the most important thing. So it's not to say, forget about any technology you've ever used or any ideas you've got, let's start from scratch, because frankly, the world has to be a bit more practical than that. So it's what do you want to achieve, and how do you engage with the right people at the right time throughout, and not just for this project, but for everything you do going forward. How do you engage with your workforce, some of whom are very much digitally immature or indeed certainly afraid of technology or seeing it taking over their roles? How do you get them to understand their role of using technology and the data that comes from technology to know when to take a step forward to intervene, when it's safe to step back? From a standards perspective, it wasn't about writing new British standards and all that sort of technical jargon. It was more about What's the right time to engage with construction partners and with architects? So when there's a new building to be created, it isn't just a case of tell us where you want us to put the Wi-Fi hub. Frankly, it's about how do you think about technology as part of the fabric of the build to ensure you can deliver far smarter services for people. Clearly, we need to ensure that there's a ability to prove the benefits both to the individual, to the service, and to the system. And then that blueprint on the right is really what are the practical things. If we want somebody to do a project similar to this tomorrow, what are the 8 to 10 simple things that could be just a checklist of guidance around data security questions to make sure any supplier you work with have to answer all the data security and ethics proposals. Working partnership, as I said, the co-production approach, of which there will be a co-production approach produced, an actual guidance document that is coming in the next month or so. We worked with each of the sites around how do you get your workforce to understand a little bit more about what tech can do, but equally that it's not here to take over. And then some of those simple tools. So consent was a big one. How do you ensure that you have consent at the right time, that you understand best interests, etc.? How do you understand how best to ask the question of suppliers to say, you might be the technical bots, but we need to make sure things are secure and safe? And how do we tell the story to allow people to do more? And this was far more around the personal stories that really rang out through this whole project, that allow other people to say, we know people just like that in our sheltered flats. We know people that don't come out of their own flats, they don't necessarily socialise, they become isolated. What did you do to help mitigate that? And therefore, what can we do? And so a couple of examples. These are real people. So Alice and Pete, they are the 2 tenant champions in Beales. So Alice 89, Pete in his early 80s as a youngster. They were interested in technology, but they weren't necessarily the biggest users of it. And they are now at a point now where they go around and they show everybody the technology in their flats. They help other tenants understand what it can do for them. And they're part of a setup in Beales where they now have a demonstration, a digital hub where people come and visit, from health and social care practitioners through to members of the public. And they want to understand what role can technology play to allow them to do those everyday things. This isn't about specialist emergency care support around pendants and fall detectors, etc., just on its own. It is very much around how do people use technology to achieve their own personalised outcomes, which could be connecting with family all over the world. It could be learning to do your online shopping using the same device that will allow you to do follow your exercise routines, that will also be able to tell you whether you're drinking enough, etc. And that's one of the biggest learnings, is you don't have to have 10 devices that you wrap around somebody's neck, when actually it's about what they each want from an individual perspective. Similarly, Rosemary in platform housing, what was interesting in Rosemary was she had been awarded in those very schemes for 40 years. So she knew what it was like working for the housing provider. So now she's very easy and very comfortable in challenging that same housing provider, who are now her landlord, to make sure they do deliver what they said they would deliver to people. And thinking about technology to support people on an individual basis, and not let's just put something in the home and not show you how to use it. So one of the big learnings for the platform is starting to think about supporting all of their tenants to know how to use it, rather than just saying, well, when you move in, you'll get these 10 things. And some of the biggest things to test, so hydration monitoring, use of smart speakers, the things that we take for granted in our own homes. Robotic vacuums has been a big hitter, because people want to be proud of their home, but when they're struggling with their mobility, can't necessarily get out and about and around the home. Wanting to be able to move and leave the property. So a lady in Southend Care hadn't left her property in 4 years. She was uncomfortable with going outside. She was worried about getting lost. Using things, again, GPS devices that we might think are simple enough because they're in our phones, allowed her to go out and about, and allowed staff to take that step back rather than constantly shadowing. And then the bottom one is connected care platforms. So how do you start to take proactive intervention based on data insights telling you when to intervene over a reduction in drinking or less movement, for example. And to prove that, on the left-hand side is an example of, there's Pete and Alice again. So they were brought in to actually interview suppliers to say, tell us how you think you can make our lives different, or how you can support us from a health wellbeing point of view. Don't just turn up with your widgets and say, you're all going to get one of these. So taking that co-productive approach to actually engaging with technology companies. And on the right-hand side is, how do you start to use things like e-learning to be able to support staff to raise their awareness, not of 50 widgets they need to remember, but scenarios, and therefore what technology could support a different condition or a different scenario. And with Build, they're using that as part of their proactive outreach that they're doing. So alongside the TAPPI program, they have been doing a proactive pilots with tenants, with people with service users. And what they're seeing is not only a big reduction in ambulance calls, because they're more familiar with people, they're getting to people before crisis, but actually a reduction in people coming to their 24/7 alarm centre, not necessarily pressure dependent as much to check when their carers come in, because they've already been proactively empowered to think, okay, I know what's going on today, for example. And the big thing for Pobl from TAPPI has been, they have now got a co-production approach across the board. They have used all of this learning to inform their 5-year strategy about how do they start to develop better services for their tenants and create a digital design brief, so that all of their new builds and redevelopments going forward will have technology at the heart to enable their tenants to do more. And some of the challenges of that are clearly, how do you fund that? How do you work with commissioners? But for them, it was important. They had to take this as almost a strategic vision that TAPPI's helped them learn. So that's enough ramble for me, because I think for me it's far more than hearing about, hopefully if I can hand over to Vikki and stop sharing, to understand what went on in Pobl and some of that learning.
Thanks, Nathan. So I'll dive straight in then, if that's okay, and then maybe we can take questions at the end. I'm just going to try and share my screen now. Okay, hopefully you're seeing my slides. Yeah, getting a few nods. Great. So yeah, hopefully this will sort of follow seamlessly on from Nathan's introduction about the kind of the overview of the TAPPI programme. And I guess just a little bit about Pobl really before we get into that. So we're a housing association, but we also provide care and support services. We're based in South East Wales, and we run right along the M4 corridor from Newport across to Carmarthenshire, sort of West Wales. So we cover about 16 different local authority areas and 4 different health boards in the geography that we work. And as was pointed out in the introduction, a whole range of services across care and supporting a really wide range of different client groups in a range of different accommodation-based services. So in care, that includes registered care services, extra care, and in support, we a whole range of support services across, floating support, mental health, learning disabilities, alcohol, substance misuse. So yeah, really, really varied in terms of our portfolio, and then a really large general needs housing provision, so 12,000 homes, providing accommodation to 25,000 customers across South Wales. Actually, we think we're pretty big because we are in Wales, but compared to some of our English counterparts, we're probably quite small. But yeah, in Wales, we're the largest housing care and support provider. And I suppose the point to make there is, in terms of our vision around assistive tech, and Nathan alluded to it, when we started on this journey, we were very aware of the complexity of our organisation and the complexity of the customers that we serve, and the kind of variety of different settings and needs that we work with people on. And so we were very aware of seeing our assistive tech services in that context, and sort of not designing a service that really only was targeted at one particular client group, in this case older people. Whilst the TAPPI project was kind of originated in old people's provision, we were really aware that actually whatever we did needed to kind of span that breadth of customers, and so we've had that in our minds really as we've gone through this journey, and I might talk a little bit about that and sort of come back to that as an issue. So when we became aware of the opportunity to be part of the TAPPI programme about 18 months ago now, I would say we were very much at the start of our assistive technology journey. We were not a large provider of assistive technology. We did have some assistive technology, what you could describe as assistive technology in some of our settings, but you know, very traditional in terms of warden control alarm systems, pendants, pull cords. You know, we hadn't gone on a journey of innovation around this at all, and it certainly wasn't sort of a core service that we provided. We had done some pilots with some funding by some of our health board partners, but I would say that was very much standalone assistive technology, so devices, more kind of aids and adaptations that could help people with their daily living, you know, things like tipping kettles, talking devices, certain equipment and aids targeted at people with dementia in our care settings, so cats and dogs and hugs and these sorts of you know, fairly standalone bits of assistive technology rather than technology enabled care. I think we've learned a lot about what the difference is really between, you know, those standalone bits of kit that you can provide to people that maybe help them with their daily living, compared to systemic technology enabled care that really changes the way you deliver services. So we were interested in, is it possible, what will the benefits be of making that transition from maybe just, you know, providing some bits of kit that help people to, you know, is this something that can be more transformative for us in terms of the way we engage with customers, deliver services, etc. So we had a 5-year strategy with 5 kind of key pillars of our, you know, our organizational transformation over the next 5 years, and one of those pillars was called Tech to the Maxes. So this isn't specifically about assistive technology, this is about our digital transformation more broadly, you know, how we use as an organization, how we use technology to engage customers, use data better, equip our staff better to work more smartly. So all of that stuff around how technology is driving our organizational change, but of which assistive technology and technology enabled care is, you know, is a consideration. And so TAPPI and the opportunity to apply for the funding and be one of the test beds came at a time for us when we were really starting to think about, okay, what does the future look like for us on our assistive technology? What's our role in this space as a housing provider? You know, it felt like there were opportunities, and it felt like this was certainly a space where we could test some stuff out, but we certainly didn't have a kind of clear vision for what that was going to be. We didn't come into this project with any specific ideas about this bit of technologies, what we want to try. You know, this is an opportunity for us to do that. It was complete blank canvas, if I'm honest. Just, you know, it was just a feeling like there are opportunities here. We've got customers who've clearly got needs and would benefit from technology. This is a great opportunity for us to learn about that, about how we can match those two things up and do something quite exciting. So I would say of all the test beds, we were probably towards the end of, you know, let's start this journey rather than kind of some of the others that were a bit further on. So our test bed then is in an extra care scheme. This is Llysa in Swansea. Extra points if anyone can pronounce that at the end. I don't speak Welsh, but I do know how to say Llysa because I've said it a lot over the last 12 months. So it's a very typical extra care scheme. It's built in 1991, so it's not really old, but it's getting to the point where probably needs a bit of modernisation, and particularly in relation to its kind of digital offer, and I'll talk about that on the next slide. But yeah, essentially it's a building where there's 42 independent flats, where 15 of those customers have extra care and 27 sort of live fairly independently, but in a scheme that's sort of staffed 24 hours a day. And there's also a day centre which is co-located with the scheme, sits alongside it. So that was another interesting opportunity that we thought this particular scheme presented, because we had the kind of residential element and then the daycare services that sat alongside that. In terms of the technology offer that was at Llysa before we started the project, hopefully you can see that picture, but yeah, very traditional sort of white box on a wall with a pull cord. I think that's probably the original system that had been put in the scheme when it was built. if staff wanted any data about who'd raised an alert or pulled their pull cord or, you know, anything like that, essentially churns out a list on that, the till or receipt type of thing that you can see on the top right hand corner with a list of codes, and staff have to get the big red book out and look up the code and see. So yeah, not fit for purpose in terms of the digital offer. We did have some Wi-Fi in the scheme, but not only in the communal areas, not hardwired, and not available in people's individual flats. And in terms of the customers there, what we found when we started talking to customers about TAPPI was a huge variation actually in customers' kind of abilities, confidence, how they were already using technology. So some people had their own broadband, had a whole range of devices, doing shopping online, you know, kind of everything that you would expect people to be doing in terms of technology. They were kind of up and running and fairly confident that right through to the other end of the spectrum, people completely terrified, never used a computer, you know, didn't do anything online, you know, complete beginners when it comes to technology. So yeah, real variation. So we were starting from, I suppose, a fairly low base in terms of our technology offer, and I suppose not really knowing at that point what we wanted to do by way of technological solutions, or even kind of what people's needs were, and how they might benefit from technology. So the first bit, and actually what we spent a lot of time doing through the TAPPI project, was just really trying to understand customers a bit better and trying to build up those use cases that Nathan talked about around, okay, what is it that people are experiencing in their day-to-day lives here? How are people living? What are some of the challenges? To start building that picture of how technology might help. So I think that TAPPI principle about being person-centred was probably the one that was most important for us early on, because what we didn't want to do was say, oh, that bit of kit or that widget or that technological solution looks really exciting. Let's get that and let's try it out with everybody and see if it kind of makes a difference. We totally reversed that process and really started from, okay, what's the needs? How are people living? What do people need support with? How can technology help that? So I suppose unsurprisingly, some of the issues that came out from our assessment of customer needs and our conversations and co-production work with customers were the ones listed on this slide, which is, you know, you'd probably expect in an extra care scheme with older people living in it. So there was a general issue around loneliness and isolation and well-being. I think even two and a half years after COVID, I think there was still a feeling that people were still pretty worried about coming out into communal areas, lost their confidence a bit, you know, the kind of sense of community not quite there still. So yeah, definitely a kind of broader well-being issue, and a feeling that people wanted to do more and wanted to re-engage, but probably a reluctance and a fear around doing that. We identified some particular issues around sensory loss, sight loss in particular. Whilst the scheme isn't a dementia specialist type of accommodation provision, we did have customers with some early dementia, which was starting to affect the way that we were having to deliver care to them, and, you know, particular issues about wandering and yeah, you know, concerns from family and friends, etc., linked to that. Physical issues around falls and mobility, so people are starting to lose their independence because of that. And generally, I suppose, those kind of day-to-day activities that, you know, particularly in the extra care customers, the people were having to have support with things like opening curtains, opening windows, cooking, making cups of tea, you know, those day-to-day activities that we take for granted. And, you know, it was really interesting to see how much of the care that people were having were focused on that sort of stuff, and to start asking questions really about how can technology maybe help bring back some of that independence and also change the way that care is being delivered, to, you know, move away from doing those sort of fairly functional tasks with customers. If you can free up some of that time spent doing opening windows or closing windows or cooking, and allow people to do that themselves, actually the time spent with customers on their care could potentially be a bit more meaningful. So yeah, started to throw up some really interesting questions about how we were spending time engaging with customers, and whether that could be made more meaningful. Obviously the co-production piece was huge actually, and that's been a really, really big journey and a big learning curve for us at Pobl. And the support we've had from the co-production works as the partner in that has been really, really helpful. I think we all think that we do co-production, you know, we all we would say, yes, we engage with customers, we involve them in decisions, we do, but I think we've really learned that actually proper, effective co-production is beyond what we probably think that we do, and is a bit more resource intensive, and yeah, it takes more time, it's a bit harder, but actually the benefits that you get from really doing that in a structured way and using some of the tools and techniques, putting some structure behind it, which we've been allowed to do through the support we've had from the TAPPI programme, has reaped loads of benefits. And as the technology aside, the benefits that we've seen with customers from being, you know, particularly those who've been our co-production champions and who've been involved in that wider group, the benefits we've seen around their self-esteem, their well-being, their confidence, their, you know, kind of just through engaging in the process, coming to meetings, being part of that group, having the opportunity to express their opinions. We've seen outcomes simply from that, which have just been, you know, people will talk about how much they've enjoyed the process and what they've gained from it, the friends they've made, you know, so it's been a really valuable process to spend that time really understanding customers and bringing them on the journey with us, trying to break down the barriers and the fears around technology. They've understood us as an organisation a lot better, because things have moved pretty slowly for reasons that I'll talk about in a minute, but that hasn't been a problem, because we've been able to have that conversation with customers about, well, this hasn't been done yet because there's these other things we need to do first, you know, the issues with suppliers. It's enabled us to have a really honest conversation with customers about timescales and the delivery of some of this stuff, and not just for TAPPI, you know, for other things going on at the scheme, whether that's about repairs or the meal provision or whatever, you know, it's just really changed the nature of the relationship with customers. So yeah, huge benefits. I think the issue is the resource intensity of it and how you maybe replicate that process at scale, because it just takes time and energy, but it does definitely reap rewards. So as we're moving on then in terms of what we've actually done at the scheme. So one of the things we identified, as I said, was this whole kind of issue about loneliness, isolation, and well-being. So in terms of technology that we've actually implemented, we've had something called the Magic Table 360 in the scheme for a few months now. It's an interactive light table. I don't know if people have seen it or aware of it. I've put a link on at the bottom of the slide. And it's basically a device that helps facilitate connections, I suppose. It's got games on it. It's got activities that aim to improve cognitive ability, physical movement, exercise, quizzes. It's all based on a light projector that responds to movement. And yeah, it's been amazing actually. We've used it in the day centre and with kind of individual customers. It's really mobile, so you can take it into people's individual rooms, or you can use it in more kind of communal group setting. And customers are using it themselves now. They're organising evenings, events, they're all coming together. Yeah, and just using it as a way to kind of build that connection and interaction. So that's been a real success. It's not really about the technology, it's about the connection between them, but technology has helped enable and foster that. It's a really cool little toy. They love playing with it, and it's kind of been a really nice, gentle introduction to technology for some people who are maybe a little bit nervous about it, because they've just seen actually it's not scary, it's just something fun we can have a play around with. And yeah, it's worked out really, really well. So that's been sort of a fairly standalone thing, but I think in terms of our wider program, is, like I say, it's been a really good stepping stone into technology for some people. Okay, so then in terms of some of the more technology enabled care stuff, so we've been on a real journey, I think, around how those use cases that I outlined in the first couple of slides, what the technological response to that is. So how can technology help with some of those use cases? And I think what we realized really early on is there's a technological solution for everything. So if it's falls, there's a whole range of solutions that can support with falls. If it's around sensory loss, there's loads of devices and widgets and gadgets, and it's really complicated. It's a really flooded market. There's loads of suppliers out there, and everyone's trying to kind of target their product at you, and it can be pretty overwhelming, actually, as somebody who's just trying to figure out, okay, well, where do we even go with this? Like, what solutions can we procure and implement? And some of the stuff that Nathan talked about around privacy and standards and quality and all of that stuff, when you're looking, and we've got people's well-being and their safety and their health in our hands, and we're kind of trying to offer solutions that can affect that. It feels like a really big responsibility, to work with the right people and choose the right supplier. So we've again been on a massive journey. We've spoken to loads of people. We've had loads of demos, loads of people coming in, and quite often they offer very similar solutions. There's sometimes not much between them. But the big thing for us was, as I said, we're a large, fairly complex organisation, and we've already got loads of IT systems, platforms. We've got stuff for our housing management, we've got stuff for our our care planning, we've got stuff that manages our rostering and our invoicing and our financing, and then you sort of start throwing assistive technology and technology over care into this, and our IT people are going, oh God, like, what else are we going to throw into all this other stuff we've got to manage? And it all, and then if you're having a different system for each one of those use cases, so if you've got something that's doing falls, and if you've got something that's doing peripherals that are monitoring movement, and if you've got something else that's feeding your bed sensor data, it's where is all this data going? How is it hosted? How do we even begin to understand it? It's really complicated. So our view as an organisation that we took really early on was this whole concept of interoperability was a really, really important TAPPI principle for us. How can things not only talk to each other, but also talk to our existing systems, so that we're not having to have staff logging on to 5 different platforms to get the data out of whatever it is that we're putting in, because it's just, that's, from a workforce point of view, that's just adding time and complexity, and that's exactly what we don't want to be doing. We want to make things really simple for each other, and kind of working with what we've already got, not necessarily kind of layering on all these different systems and data points to what we've already got. So interoperability was really, really key. And what we found is that when we talked to suppliers, they could often offer one solution for one particular need, but it didn't always kind of fit together. So yeah, we've been a bit on a journey on that. And the company that we're working with at the moment, Yorball, one of the attractions with that was that it seemed to offer us that interoperable solution. So we're currently working up a kind of a plan with them to install a whole range of devices, wearables, various kind of peripherals and sensors, and the point is it's very bespoke, very person-centered. So not everybody's having the same thing. Some people will have a really, really basic package. Some people will have a much more comprehensive package depending on their own needs and use cases. But the point is it's kind of one platform that can do pretty much everything that they want. And what we've liked about Yorble is where they haven't been able to do it, they've been keen to kind of work with us to say, well, we can't do that yet, but we will work with you to kind of develop that solution. So it's become a much more of a kind of R&D project rather than just buying something that's off the shelf and trying to make it fit to our our existing systems. It's okay, let's develop something. What's that's meant though is it's taken time. It's become a bit of a bigger project, a bigger beast than maybe we would have envisaged first time round. Would probably been a lot easier if we just bought something off the shelf and tried it out. We kind of, there's days when we regret taking this particular route, but I think it means that ultimately in the longer term we'll have a better ecosystem, and I'll talk about that in a minute, because this has really fed our wider vision about what it is we want to offer at scale for our customers in the future. And it's really it's about for our customers having a really simple technological solution where everything in their home, all of their assistive technology is kind of controlled by one thing. So in Yorble's case, it's a variety, it can be any kind of Android system. But the idea is if you've got a fall detector, or if you've got some environmental monitoring, or some voice activated kind of smart home type stuff that can open your curtains, or open your windows, or turn things off, on and off in the kind of IoT smart home space, that's all kind of works from the same thing. It all kind of works off an Android device rather than having a different solution for each one of those things. So that's really, really important. But it's taken some developmental work, and we're not quite there yet, but our IT people are kind of working on that, and hopefully we'll have a solution that does that by the time we've finished this project. So yeah, just to pick up a bit of that in a bit more detail then, because I think that's been really important. So yeah, we didn't really come into this project thinking about this idea of a digital ecosystem, but what TAPPI has done is really made us understand that digital transformation, technology-enabled care, is part of a wider digital transformation, and you can't look at it in isolation. So it became really clear to us as soon as we started looking into this space and thinking about what we might offer, that actually infrastructure, and when I talk about infrastructure, I'm talking about Wi-Fi connectivity, broadband, etc., is absolutely key to making some of this stuff work, because most stuff works off a really good internet connection. So if you haven't got that offering right for us as a landlord, if we're not really kind of geared up to be providing that as part of our service offer, then that's a really big barrier for us to overcome. So again, that's not something that we offered as standard, not part of our core service offer as a landlord. We don't provide broadband, but it's again made us completely rethink about what we offer in that space. So that's become a whole project in itself. We also had a separate project going on around electronic care planning, so moving from paper records to digital customer records, and customers being able to kind of access their own care plans electronically, and all of that's again a whole separate project which will hopefully reap loads of benefits to our service provision. But again, we realised that these things needed to talk to each other. There's no point just putting peripheries and kit in and then having a completely separate electronic care plan if the data that we're getting from someone's movement detectors is saying actually they're experiencing there's a risk that they're experiencing decline here, or their habits are changing, which might need to prompt a review to their care plan. That needs to be feeding into the electronic care plan, because otherwise that data is going to sit over there and their care plan is going to sit over here, and it's not going to talk to each other. So that integration piece has become really important. And likewise, we've got a whole program of stuff going on around our asset management. You'll have heard all the stories around damp and mold and all of that kind of stuff that housing associations are facing, and we're increasingly using technology to help us provide a really good service and get intelligence on our buildings and our kind of assets in that regard. So those temperature, humidity sensors, all of that kind of asset management, environmental monitoring stuff. There's a whole different part of our organisation who's using technology to get us better data around that, and that's again sending stuff into us as an organisation. And I suppose it's just about all of this stuff needs to join up and talk to each other, and that's where the challenge is for a large complex organisation like us, is just not having 50 different systems doing 50 different types of data and none of it talking to each other. So yeah, that's been our learning, and our vision is that it does talk to each other and we have this kind of seamless integration, and yeah, that's kind of where TAPPI has really helped us think about that. It's gone from providing assistive technology in one particular scheme to, okay, what is our 10-year digital vision? And it's really been transformative for us in helping us understand that we need to be thinking about all of this stuff in the round, and we can't just pick off one bit because there's so many interdependencies. So yeah, conscious of time, I think I've just got 2 more slides. Yeah, so I mean, I'd love to be here sitting you telling you that we've put this technology in and this has been the outcomes for customers. And unlike some of the other test beds, we're not at that place yet, because our technology offer is like I say, is only just about to be going in. But having said that, there's still so much that we've learned from being part of TAPPI and the journey that we've been on so far. One of those things is that true interoperability is really, really hard to find, and you quite often have to build it yourself if you want it to be really, really bespoke to your needs. So yeah, when people kind of talk to you about interoperability, and I don't know about this stuff from a technical point of view, because I'm not I'm not a tech expert. I've got people in the organisation that are helping out with that sort of stuff. But yeah, interoperability is really hard to do, really hard to find if you want it to really work with your systems. Like I say, the technology of the care market is really complex and varied, and that suite of tools that Nathan talked about around how you engage with that sector, if you're looking to go on this journey, what questions do you need to ask? How can you be assured that they've got the quality controls in place? What are their warranties and safety, criteria? All of that. How are they going to use your data? How are they going to keep it private? All of those questions, that's outside of, as a housing care support provider, that's a lot of that is outside of our remit and our expertise. So having support with that has just been amazing. And I think the suite and the framework that Nathan talked about for people coming behind us is going to be really, really useful. I mentioned the basic connectivity and infrastructure. Wi-Fi, broadband, absolutely fundamental to some of this. We couldn't have been on this journey if we didn't have technical expertise. We got a new director of technology who joined Pobl a couple of months after we started the TAPPI programme. And I would say the buy-in and the leadership from the technology side of our business has been fundamental, really, to making TAPPI a thing that's going to have longevity and sustainability in Pobl. I was project managing it. I had some colleagues in the sort of care team. We were really interested in the people and their use cases and how technology could benefit them. And I think we would have just hit an absolute roadblock if we didn't then be able to bring in our technology colleagues who have the expertise around protocols and all of that language that is just goes once I get to a certain point, about how things actually work, and they're talking about things like battery life and how we kind of asset manage some of this stuff. How do we know when a fall detector battery is going to fail, and what are the backups, and all of that stuff. Really, really, how does it integrate with our fire alarms and smoke detectors and door entry systems, and like all of that really, really important stuff that I can take it to a certain point, but you really need that technological expertise. So having that leadership, that buy-in, that kind of vision across the organisation has been really, really important. And yeah, I think has really helped it take it from a small project about assistive technology and trying out some of the TAPPI principles to one that is absolutely driving digital transformation for us as an organisation. okay, but I suppose in the back of my mind throughout this has always been where we go next. I think we've always had scalability in our minds when we right from the point that we put the TAPPI funding application form in. It was never going to be, oh, let's just do a nice thing at one of our schemes and see how it goes. For us, it was always about what can we learn from this that's going to enable us to expand this out to our whole customer base. And I think that's what my first point about the breadth and complexity of our service users, and making sure that, you know, whatever solutions we land on are adaptable, which is another TAPPI principle, to those different groups, has been really, really important. And the Yorble solution that I mentioned earlier, again, one of the kind of benefits of that is that it felt like it had it could be applied whether you're talking to a group of customers with learning disabilities or in a supported living environment, or it felt like it would be really, really adaptable, even to the point of using it in a homeless hostel or with customers who are recovering from substance misuse, etc. So yeah, but again, it's how we fund that as an organisation going forward. It's great to have some grant money to sort of pump prime this and do all this learning, but if we're talking about rolling it out to 12,000 customers, who's going to pay for that? So we've had some interesting conversations with commissioners and our partners about this. They're really interested in TAPPI. They really want to stay in touch with what we're doing and learn from that, and but it hasn't really gone beyond that in terms of, okay, and therefore we're going to kind of commission this at scale yet. We're hoping it does lead to some of those conversations, but I think the challenge is for us working across so many different health boards and local authority areas is we've got so many different commissioning partners, and they're all at different stages of their assistive technology and technology-enabled care journeys, that it's hard to have that consistent approach across all of our customers. And what we don't want is kind of a postcode lottery where we've got this arrangement with this commissioner, and so the customers who live in X location can have this, but the customers can't. So yeah, we're having, I think, those conversations about what it is we fund, how we fund it, what parts our commissioners fund. Is there a commercial offer here for customers, like friends, families and customers themselves willing to actually pay for some of this stuff themselves? These are all questions that we're having to ask. We haven't got the answers to all of them yet, but they're making us think about some of these questions. Data and privacy, again, the more of this that we do, the more data that we get from customers, I think the challenge around data and privacy becomes increasingly difficult. Again, we haven't got answers to that yet, but it feels like something we need to give a lot of thought to around consent and where data is stored, and just making sure we're absolutely on the money when it comes to what we're doing around people's data, etc. And then I suppose it's that it's like how we measure and evaluate all of this. University of Cambridge have done some great work and have produced some really useful tools in terms of evaluating the particular project itself, so kind of really understanding the benefits that is brought to customers, to the workforce, and to us as a wider organisation. So I feel like we've made progress in that, but it's kind of that cumulative cost benefit of analysis. Again, if we're going to go to commissioners and say we want to kind of offer this as part of our service model, it's really understanding, does it save money, or does it just allow us to deliver services in a better way? And if so, what's the return? What's that social value? What's the return on investment? How do we put a price on that? What's the economics of that? And again, that's not a new that's not something that's probably challenged with. That's something that I think everybody in this space is struggling with. How you really understand the benefits of some of this stuff. How do you capture that and kind of translate that into language that health boards and local authority partners, social services, etc. kind of understand. So those are all things that we're still continuing to work through, but I think TAPPI has really helped frame our thinking on this, and is certainly like the tools and resources that have been produced as part of that framework are really supporting us in helping to answer some of these big questions. So yeah, I've probably talked to you long enough, so I will stop sharing now, and hopefully Nathan and I can, between us, answer any questions that you might have.
Thank you so much. That was a really great and really honest reflection around the complexity and the challenges and co-production and all the sorts of things that are very much there in all the sort of policy, but without that sort of nuance, I think, around reflecting on some of that. So